Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event this afternoon with Walter Russell Mead on the topic History, American Greatness, and the State of Israel. Walter Mead's visit with us, a visit that includes two events, represents the third installment in our fall 2018 program on the general theme of patriotism, nationalism, and the idea of America. Later this evening, Walter will address the topic Examining America First, Nationalism and Jacksonian Democracy in the 21st Century. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm Professor of Religion and Philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the Institute sponsoring our event this afternoon, as well as the fall program just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing this event, special thanks go to Shannon Regier, Greg Seams, Molly Work, Carrie Vanderveen, and Jeff O'Donnell and his crew. Our guest this afternoon, Walter Russell Mead, is Distinguished Fellow at the Hudson Institute, the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, and the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. From 1997 to 2010, Walter Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, serving as the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy from 2003 until his departure. Our distinguished guest writes on a variety of subjects, ranging from international affairs to religion, culture, education, and the media. He's contributed to a wide assortment of leading American journals, ranging from Mother Jones to GQ. He serves as a regular reviewer of books for Foreign Affairs and frequently appears on national and international radio and television programs. He's published a number of important books, including one on the history of American foreign policy entitled Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World. That book received the Lionel Gelber Award for Best Book in English on International Relations in 2002. In my own reading of that book, I find it remarkable for its historical sweep, its erudition, its analytical power, and its wisdom. Most pertinent to our topic this afternoon, Walter's next book, The Ark of a Covenant, The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People, is scheduled to be published by Knopf in 2021. This is a book that develops insights from his article, originally published in the journal Foreign Affairs in 2008, an article entitled The New Israel and the Old, Why Gentile Americans Back the Jewish State. We're so pleased to have Walter Russell Mead with us this afternoon to speak on the topic History, American Greatness, and the State of Israel. Will you join me in welcoming him?
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for turning out. I was going to say on such a chilly day, but probably up here in Minnesota, this is a summery afternoon. Great. Well, I'm going to disappoint a lot of you maybe because I'm going to not be making a lot of controversial pronouncements about what's U.S.-Israel relations, what they should be, what they shouldn't be. This is not going to be a talk about, what the solution to the dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians should be, or whose fault that it hasn't been settled already. It's not, I'm going to do my best not to use the words Donald Trump after that one in the speech. And a lot of it is going to be about history. all of these are important subjects, by the way, but then, we'll have a Q&A period afterwards if any of you would like to get into them. But you know what? My ideas about that stuff really aren't any better than anybody else's. Over the years, I have spent a fair amount of time in the region. The first time I went to Israel was actually to meet with Yasser Arafat when he was in Gaza. And I have to say that was an interesting experience, sort of talking to the border. And why are you here? Well, I'm here to see Yasser Arafat. And so, everybody from Yasser Arafat to Bibi Netanyahu. I've spent a lot of time traveling around the Middle East and through the Islamic world, giving talks sometimes on this subject, sometimes on others. So one thing I say is don't worry, you probably don't have a question more challenging or doubts more thorough than some that I have, even from my own students at Bard College. So, I see something to drink down here, terrific. So if that's what the talk is not about, what's the talk about? My talk is I'm trying to answer a question as I work on this book on U.S.-Israel relations. Why is it that American public opinion is so much more pro-Israel than public opinion in so many other countries? Now, this is one of the oldest and most pronounced trends in public opinion in the United States, is that if you ask Americans, do they sympathize more with Israelis or with Palestinians, going back really to the 1930s when people first begin to ask these kinds of questions, and public opinion polling is still in its infancy, there's two strong trends. One is that substantially more Americans say they support the Israelis, or at one point Palestinian Jews, and the other is that over time there's been a slow, not inexorable, it kind of goes up and down a bit, but a slow rise in the percentage of Americans who say they support Israel. So this was, at one point, it was not an anomaly in Western opinion. That is, in the 1950s, Israel was actually more popular in a lot of Western Europe than it was in the United States. When the Six-Day War began, tens of thousands of Frenchmen marched on the Israeli embassy in order to volunteer to do civilian work in Israel to release Israelis to go to the front to fight. Okay, this is probably not the sort of demonstration you would see in Paris today under similar circumstances. And for many years too, support for Israel in world politics, in Europe especially, was found on the left. In the United States, to be pro-Israel was to sort of declare yourself a member of the left. Many famous American communists like Paul Robeson, or radicals like the fiery young Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, were not only pro-Israel, they were pro-Irgun, which was the armed wing that broke away from Haganah and was carrying on a guerrilla struggle with the British. So you can go back and listen to some of the lefty folk groups of the 1950s, like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and included in their concerts are songs of the Israeli kibbutz movement. Israel at one point, support for Israel was considered something that good Republicans didn't really do. Democrats kind of in their lascivious way dabbled in, but it was really something that you had to go to the socialists and the left to find the full-throated pro-Israel sentiment. Now obviously that is not the case today. And as support for Israel in public opinion in much of Europe has diminished, it's actually, and it has diminished on the left in the United States in some of the same ways, but has risen on the right. And in some ways, that's one of the differences between the United States and Western Europe, is that a sort of second shift of pro-Israel opinion appears on the right as the initial post-World War II left-wing support begins to fade away. But anyway, there are a couple of things I think we first have to look at before we can talk about where support for Israel comes from. The kind of classic thing you'll hear from people who, you know, we've all got very strong opinions on this subject, or most of us do. But the kind of classic thing you'll hear is, well, there's really two basic, areas of support for Israel in American public opinion: American Jews and fundamentalist Christians who believe in the end times in some sort of crazy, apocalyptic scenario involving Israel in Bible prophecy. If you break that down numerically, first you've got a problem here where about 25% of the population comes up as evangelical, according to pollsters. Now, already that's a problem. As I think many people in this state would know, there are a lot of people who, for whom the word evangelical is just another way to say Lutheran. And it's also the case that many African American Protestant Christians would say theologically they're evangelical, even though their political views are quite different in some ways than for many white evangelicals. So when we say there's 23 to 25% of the United States that is evangelical, that does not translate on anything like a one-to-one basis into support for Israel. The same way, American Jews, who are about 2% of the population, and their share is dropping, American Jews actually are to the left of the average American position on Israel. This is, I think, one of the big myths out there, that there is this kind of monolithic pro-Israel right-wing Jewish, that's where it's coming from. If you think about it, in every presidential election of the 21st century, the American Jewish community has broken heavily against the most pro-Israel presidential candidate. So George W. Bush loses the Jewish vote both times he runs. Barack Obama wins the Jewish vote. Only African Americans were more supportive of Barack Obama as president and in his re-election campaign than American Jews. In the same way, American Jews broke heavily for Hillary Clinton over I wasn't going to use the word, over the current president of the United States. All right, and it's not only Jewish votes, all right, Jewish money. Democrats have consistently gotten more Jewish money than Republicans in these 21st century races. So to say that somehow there is this, to say that a certain American policy, which is opposed by a majority of Jewish voters and a majority of Jewish donors, is somehow a Jewish policy or reflects the influence of a Jewish lobby on American politics, is crazy talk. Just crazy talk. I think, frankly, it is ignorance rather than anti-Semitism that is responsible for the sort of degree of public faith in this. Ignorance is a resource that we as a people, I think, will never run short of. Okay, so In any case, even if you had every evangelical and every Jew solidly out there in favor of Bibi and Likud and hardline Israel policies, that only gets you to about 25% of the population, and as much as 60% of the population will tell pollsters that they're pro-Israel. So even if all of these people who demonstrably aren't particularly pro-Israel in many cases in this conventional way of thought you still have less than half of pro-Israel public opinion accounted for by evangelicals and Jews. You can see why this intrigues me as a scholar, as a student of American foreign policy. Where the heck is this coming from? And that is what I've been looking at, and I've got some ideas to share with you this afternoon. I'm still working on this, and we'll learn more, I hope. But it's been a very useful experience for me. It's actually taught me a lot about American culture and American history to see where this is coming from. If you look into American history, you can see all kinds of cultural forces that have led Americans going back into the colonial days and continuing until now, where many Americans have sort of seen in the Jewish people a kind of a mirror of the American experience. You think about it, you think about the early American revolutionaries and colonials. Here they are, they have this idea of democracy, this idea that they think is world transforming. There's 3 million of them here in the United States, and they have this idea that they have this truth not just for themselves, but for the entire world. Well, who's another small people that bears an idea that is intended to change the world? It's the Jews. And of course, the Bible was far and away the most read book in the United States of the time, as I believe it still is today. And so this is something that people would see. They would get this. Their parents are reading them the Bible stories. They're reading them to their kids, and they're seeing the parallels between the Jews as God's people in a world where they have a mission, and Americans in the same way. And like as the Jewish people, and you read the prophets and the other elements of the Jewish scriptures, the Jews are constantly being told in the Bible, you have this special blessing from God, but it's not just because you're special, it's because you have a job to do, you have a covenant to fulfill. And if you fulfill your covenant, if you behave like you're supposed to do, God is going to bless you. But if you don't, God is going to smite you. And a lot of the Bible is stories of how kings didn't do what God said, and lo and behold, God did indeed smite them and smite the people. You can look at American foreign policy debates, from the Rwanda genocide on back into the 19th century and further up today, and you see our concept of ourselves as a people is suffused with this idea. God has given us this beautiful land to live in and these freedoms. We have to live up to this. This imposes a duty on us. We're not simply here to sit around and enjoy ourselves and watch TV. If there's a genocide, what kind of people are we if we don't respond? And also, what will happen to us as a people if we don't live up to this? So there's a sense in which the American people have been seeing parallels between their own situation in the world and the situation in the Jews. In some cases, many preachers and writers have spoken of, God as America's new Israel. In my view, that's theologically not a very good way to think about things. I don't think America is the new Israel. There's Israel and there's the church, and I think it's a big mistake to start elevating nation states into that category, but people have done it, whether I think it's a good idea or not. It's part of the way American culture has worked for a very long time, and in many ways still continues to work. All right, so that's the first point. The second reason that I think that Americans have tended to just kind of just sympathize with Israel, think a Jewish state is a good idea, is that actually Americans have seen the Jewish people in a different way than Europeans, even liberal and pro-Semitic, pro-Zionist, pro-Jewish Europeans have done. If you go back to the Enlightenment, they teach about the Enlightenment here at St. Olaf's, right? I don't want to introduce too many challenging new subjects, but you go back there, and there was a kind of a deal that was on offer, and the French even made it as a sort of formal deal to the Jews. They say, listen, if you will give up being governed by Jewish personal law for inheritances and stuff like that, and give up the idea that Jews are a nation, right? But if you say that Jews are a religious community, we'll accept you as French citizens on an equal footing with all other French citizens. So just as there are French Catholics and French Protestants, there are also French Jews, or as they would say, French citizens of Jewish origin. And then just as there are, Italian Catholics and German Catholics and French Catholics, there are Italian Jews and German Jews and French Jews. And so the Jews of a different European country were seen, particularly by liberals, as possessing the same nationality as the peoples around them. There's no category of a Jewish nation. In American life, we had a kind of a different approach to these things. And it wasn't, people weren't thinking about the Jews. Didn't come out of this at all. It sort of comes out of English religious history, where unlike in most countries of Europe, you had at the time of the Reformation, you had a period of religious struggle, either short or long, and at the end of it, one side won. So in Norway, the Lutherans won, and there just weren't a lot of Catholic Norwegians. I guess at one point there was a Catholic Swede, and she had to go to Rome because she couldn't be Queen of Sweden as a Catholic. In England, something different happened. Nobody won the Reformation. The Anglicans, got kind of government monopolies, but there were too many others. There were too many of those darn Methodists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists running around, and you couldn't just persecute them all. There were too many, and you'd have another civil war, and no one wanted that. So what people ended up with was this idea of sort of denominations. Okay, we're all English. Some of us are Anglicans, some of us are Methodists, some of us are Congregationalists, whatever you may have, but you have a kind of a sub-identity within the national identity. And the colonies imported all of this English religious diversity, and on top of that, they had the colonial diversity. So there were, each of the 13 colonies was almost like an independent country in the way that it thought of itself. And by the way, the colonies often, were religiously different. So that Massachusetts was mostly Puritan, and Virginia was mostly Anglican, and so on, at least at one point. And so American identity, national identity, has this kind of sort of two-story concept, that we're all Americans, but then somebody can be, but that doesn't mean that we all belong to the same religion. It doesn't, and we're all Americans, but some of us are Southerners, and some of us are New Englanders. We have regional and local sub-identities. When you start in the 19th century to get massive immigration into the United States, including Jewish immigration, the ethnic immigrants sort of get slotted into this. So you have Irish Americans, Polish Americans, German Americans, Norwegian Americans, again, sort of denominations within an overarching union. And this works very well, it turns out, for the Jews, because considered religiously, the Jews are a religious denomination, a little kind of out there, like the Mormons and the Unitarians, from the standpoint of everybody else. My brother tells me that in his Virginia suburb, they say that Unitarians are atheists with children. And he also says that Unitarians are people who believe that there is at most one God. But in any case, the idea is that you have these different denominations. It's not un-American to have an ethnic ID or a religious ID. It's American. It's American to be Irish American and dye the river green on St. Patrick's Day and root for Ireland and even maybe give money to the IRA, to want Ireland to beat England and to want America to help Ireland in international politics. That's not un-American. It's Irish American. It's American. And so for Jews coming into this system, there's a place that's no different from anybody else's, but one that works for you in a way that in no other place does it. And so Zionism is a Zionist Jew is no more an oddity in America than a pro-Irish American or a pro-Polish American. What this also means is that non-Jewish Americans just think of American Jews and they think of Jews the way they think of Poles, a nation. Of course they're a nation. There's a Jewish people, obviously. It's not obvious to people in Europe that there is a Jewish nation. And that's one reason that for Americans, the idea that the Jewish nation should have self-determination. Well, Poland wants to have an independent state. Ireland wants to have an independent state. Italy wants a united Italy. Well, the Jews want to have a Jewish state. That feels like common sense to people in a way that it doesn't necessarily in other places. And this really actually comes up in diplomacy. After World War II, the British Foreign Secretary, Bevan, very interesting guy, is talking to the Americans about what to do with the Jews in the displaced persons camps of Western Europe, the surviving Jews. And there are millions of displaced people. There are Polish displaced people, there are French, everyone in Western Europe has been stirred around and what are they going to do, where they're going to go. And there's a dispute. The British are saying, look, if we set up special displaced person camps for Polish Jews, we're finishing Hitler's work for him. Hitler was the one that said that Polish Jews weren't Poles, right? And we as the good guys are saying, no, the Polish Jews are Poles. And so they should go in the camps with the other Poles. Now, the fact that there were anti-Semitic riots and hundreds of people being killed in Poland, and that maybe the Jews didn't feel comfortable going into those camps, wasn't as important as we want to reintegrate the Polish people, the French people. They're Jewish and they're non-Jewish citizens. For the Americans, that just made no sense at all. The Americans are saying, no, no, no. The Jews are a people, and there should be, just like there should be Polish displaced persons camps, there should be Jewish displaced persons camps. And it just seemed obvious to the Americans. And the Americans and the Brits were actually each calling the other anti-Semitic because they had a different approach to this. Okay, and you can make arguments either way. And different Jews have chosen different paths in this. But the fact that the way that Jews have integrated into the structures of American life is under the kind of ethnic denominational sub-identity model means that for the average American who doesn't think about these things consciously very much at all, but just simply kind of looks at the way things are, Jews are people. Jews are a nation like other nations. So that is, I think, one. So that from that point of view, Zionism looks like a very natural thing. Just sort of when Americans kind of first think about it or first look at it. Oh yeah, a state for the Jews. Now they will also say, and on the same basis, well, yeah, there should be a state for the Palestinians too. Yeah, the Palestinians are people. Yeah, and it's complicated to work it out, but hey, it wasn't that easy to work it out with the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnians and so on. These things are hard, but yeah, the Palestinians should have a state. The Jews should have a state. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why the two-state solution, regardless of practicality or justice or anything else, is the idea that just over and over and over again pops up when kind of Americans look at this question. Well, obviously, they should both have a state. Okay. There is a third area, a reason, I think, and this gets a little bit more complicated as to why Americans see Israel with sympathy and often approval. And this gets us to some American ideas about America's place in world history and even the kind of nature of the historical process. America is a country that believes in progress. But progress of originally of a very special kind, and even still in many ways, it's bound up in all kinds of religious ideas about human destiny. Probably if I ask you how many of you are familiar with the concept of the historicization of the eschaton, I'm not going to get a lot of, no. Okay. No, I'm not. All right. Okay. Eschaton is from Greek words. It means the end, the last times. And it's sort of, the eschaton is the culmination of history. It's like, where is the human story headed? And if you have at all a progressive cast of mind, you sort of think, well, history is coming out of barbarity and poverty and ignorance, and we're slowly ascending a mountaintop until at some point we will reach a kind of universal enlightenment, affluence, science, democracy, progress, all of these things. And basically people will have nice lives and be able to do what they want, and we're not going to die of too many illnesses, and life is going to be good, and getting there is what history is supposed to be about. This is one of the kind of deepest convictions of the American mind, that in general both very liberal and very conservative, very religious and very secular Americans tend to think this way. I can even say feel this way, because it's not something that we sort of reason out as much as just it's in the air that we breathe in. It's what we think is happening and should happen. And this is something that has been with us for a very, very long time, that the early Americans, like the British, sort of looked at history, and American independence comes right in the middle of the Enlightenment, but at a time of great scientific and social and moral progress. And the Americans are thinking, okay, what's going on in the world? How do we understand how world history, it seems like after centuries of just, pointless war and poverty and anger and, just, so, now we're like chugging up the hill. What's happening? And religious Americans and non-religious each had their own versions of the story, but it really, the kind of common narrative was this. Well, you had Greece and Rome and, the early church, and that was pretty good. Then come the Dark Ages and everything goes bad. But then beginning with the Reformation, if you're religious, you say God is at work, and if you're not, you say, well, the force is at work, something is at work. And with the Reformation, they recover the ideas, the scholarship of antiquity. And the world starts to get better as they apply this. The next point is the Reformation, which in the Protestant world, at least, people interpret as just as what the Renaissance did in the world of kind of secular culture. The Reformation does in religion. It cleanses the impurities. It gets us back to the pure Christian faith the way it was supposed to be. And this steps up the rate of progress in the world even more. The third step is revolution, where the English-speaking world in particular reintroduces political liberty into the calculation. And so you get toleration in England, freedom of the press, American Revolution, republicanism, beginnings of democracy. And this is not just something, again, that's supposed to happen only in this one little corner of the world. This is the spear tip of the advance of all humanity into this new age of immense progress and endless opportunity. And America is the spear tip of history, of progressive history. And this naturally brings you to thinking about, well, where's it all going? And you start thinking about apocalyptic, eschatological ideas. Now, now suddenly we sound like we're talking, Left Behind and the rapture and all of this kind of stuff. Well, for some people, that's the way they think about it. But more generally, when Frank Fukuyama was writing about the end of history, he's talking about exactly this, that we reach the point where we have democracy, we have liberty, we have prosperity. History is over, and we've ended history and gone into this wonderful post-historical future where everything is better. No more war, no more oppression, no more bigotry. It just gets better from here. And America is supposed to be making this happen. All right. That's the basic picture. Where does Israel come into this, you might well ask? It comes in through several different ways. One of them is very religious, which is that a hallmark of Anglo-American Christianity from the 17th century forward was a school of biblical interpretation that said that in the last days, the Jews will return to the Holy Land, that there will be a second return from the second exile. So you have, actually, the Puritan fathers believed this. Christian Zionism comes into America on the Mayflower. When the Pilgrims were still in the Netherlands as exiles from England, they sent a petition to the stadtholder of the Netherlands asking him to assist the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine as part of this future that they could see. Kind of crazy, but they did. And on the secular side, there was also, people looked at the history of the world, and they looked and they saw like these three great peoples of antiquity: the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans. I mean, you look at the history at antiquity, these groups were amazing. Heroes, armies. You read about their countries, and their countries are beautiful and rich and powerful. You looked at them in 1800 or 1850, it's like the Greeks, well, they're oppressed under the Turks and they're poor. The Italians are oppressed under the Austrians, and from the standpoint of Protestant Americans, even worse, the Pope. And it's just unspeakably horrible, and they're degraded and oppressed. And then the Jews, worse than anybody, despised by everybody, no power. Any place in the world you want to kick somebody and have nothing happen, go find a Jew and kick the Jew. And these are the great peoples of antiquity. Well, if we're really renewing the universe and bringing progress and redeeming what's gone wrong, all right, it should work for these peoples. When you have the Greek War of Independence, Americans actually go volunteer to fight for the Greek War of Independence. That was the first media event in the world of human rights, was the Greek War for Independence. When Lord Byron dies fighting for the Greeks, this was like, Bono dies fighting for Tibetan independence or something. It was, just a huge media sensation. And America was caught up in it totally. Julia Ward Howe, the woman who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, her husband was a hero of the Greek War of Independence, a Massachusetts person who volunteered and was decorated by the Greek government. Italian, the same thing. And Americans were hugely involved. We actually offered Garibaldi a position as general in the American Civil War. Could never work out the details. But when the Italians rose up in rebellion to establish a republic and free themselves of the Pope, when the rebellion collapsed, the U.S. sent the Navy to Rome to offload humanitarian political refugees to give them asylum and bring them to America where they would be safe. So there was a huge American fixation with the redemption of the ancient peoples. And the idea then, too, was that the Jews, and this became almost an idée fixe for some Americans, that if the Jews would go to Palestine, leave evil cities, and go out and farm, then this weak, despised people would begin to grow strong and great. Americans actually bought farmland outside Jerusalem and tried to persuade Jews in Jerusalem to come out and farm on it. It's like, it's too hot, I don't want to farm, I want to study Torah. But they were trying to like drag these Jews, farm, darn it. And they wouldn't. But when you start to get a Jewish Zionist movement that's beginning to like farm, because the Americans said, look, here's what's going to happen. If the Jews discover these wonderful American virtues of democracy, hard work, and agriculture, they will go from being a weak, powerless, despised, and oppressed people to being a strong people, rich people, advanced people. And when the whole world sees how American principles can take the Jews from the bottom of the heap to the top of the heap, then everyone in the world will know that America is right, that we're on the right track. And so when the Zionist movement begins among Jews, Americans are not thinking, oh, now the Jews want to drag us into their stupid Middle Eastern venture. They're thinking, oh, great, the Jews are finally figuring it out and getting with the program. They finally understand that the Americans know what's good for them. So this, and during the 20th century, if you go back and you read accounts in the American press of what's happening in Palestine as the Jews return and begin the farming and so on, you have a combination of these two things at work. On the one hand, you're seeing the the religious hope. The Jews come back, and the people was under people in the land were separated, and each was accursed. Now they're coming together again, and the people are flourishing. The land is flourishing. This is a sign that the Bible is true, that God is in control of what's happening in the world, and a miracle is happening before our eyes. You're seeing that side of it, but you're also seeing they're making the desert bloom. Hard work, farming, democracy is turning these run-down, underfed, weak urban Jews and socialists and communists in Europe into much more formidable, upstanding, real Americans out there in the Middle East. And so this very odd notion, when odd at least by some lights, that that Zionism is shows that America is right, is something that I think is still at a level that people don't consciously process, is still out there in our culture, and it shapes the way people interpret events that they read about or see on TV. There are a couple of other things that are worth pointing out. One is that there's been in the last 150 years, people who haven't liked capitalism, by and large, don't like America, don't like American-style democracy, and also, by and large, don't like Jews and don't like Zionism. So that if you find somebody in France who is viciously anti-American, this is not hard to do in France. Very often, it's linked to a critique of capitalism as a soulless economic system that is exploitative and has no room for the heart and the whole human being, which may well be true, but then it sees the Jew as the sort of soulless individual, the rootless cosmopolite who is happy in this empty globalistic capitalist universe. And so over and over and over again, you find that the people who don't like Zionism don't like American capitalism or America. And while, so there's a sense that, gosh, well, if all these people hate us both, well, we're sticking together. There may be something in that. If the Palestine, the disputed videos and so on, let's not get into it, but there was a belief in America that after 9/11, there were people in the Middle East who celebrated this event. And they were the same people who hate Israel, or the Iranians, death to America, death to Israel. During the Cold War, the communists were anti-America, anti-Israel, and often wrapped them together in demonstrations. So being targeted together. There's one final point I want to make. I hope this is not too dull and too historical, but if it is, I'm sorry. There's not much I can do at this point, I suppose. But one final point I want to make is there's an interesting parallel in attitudes toward war. In America, I'll talk about this more tonight in the interview, We have a kind of a tradition of what I call Jacksonian foreign policy. It's unilateralist. It's kind of, it's very defensively aggressive. It doesn't much believe in international law. It thinks that if somebody attacks you, you should just attack them. So for example, let's say some day in Palestine, in Gaza, they send up some rockets and they attack an Israeli village and a barn is destroyed or school kids are killed, something. Now, most people in the world, particularly in Europe, would say, well, that is terrible, and, maybe the Israelis should do something back, but the idea is their response should be proportionate. This wasn't a huge act of war, so your retaliation should be limited, okay? American culture doesn't really work that way. If a foreign country were, attacking the United States, we don't just attack them proportionally. The idea is, no, we bomb the heck out of them and we crush them and we pound them and pound them and pound them. And, in other words, more or less what Israel does in Gaza. And a lot of the world looks at this and they say, look, what the Palestinians did was wrong. We agree. That was not the right thing to do. But what you're doing, sending in the Air Force and the tank, and you're destroying schools and, all of this, is worse than what they did originally. And now you brought yourself down to their level and even below. And so public opinion in many countries moves away from Israel in these situations. Much more often than not in the United States, it moves toward Israel. As you're doing exactly the right thing. The only way to deal with terrorism is to squash the terrorists. And so there's a division of response based on kind of just this gut feeling that people have of what's right or wrong. It's very hard to argue people in or out of this, and not all Americans think this way. But there is a basic sense in which, from the standpoint of American opinion, the people who started it, all the responsibility is on them. If they put weapons in a school, a munition storehouse, and you're not deliberately targeting kids, but they've used kids as human shields. If you, in trying to get rid of those weapons, kids die, that blood is not on your hands. It's on the hands of the people who put those kids there, who used them as human shields, and who started the whole thing by starting the firing. Now, I'm not saying this is the right, just way to think. I'm just saying that in American culture, this is the way a lot of people instinctively think. And so in trying to understand public opinion in the United States, we have to see how our history and our culture has created predispositions, not among all Americans, and not among all Americans to the same degree, but certain kind of general tendencies that shape the way we interpret contemporary events, and then some very specific ideas that we interpret crisis situations and violence. And to a degree not found in other Western countries, the cultural preconditions in American life tend to favor a sympathy for the Zionist cause. And so my conclusion, so far as I have one here, is that support for Israel in the United States is not a shallow thing. It's fairly deeply rooted. It's all during my lifetime, people have been predicting sort of imminent big shifts in public opinion, the next generation. And that's what they say about my generation, that my generation would have a very different approach. So far, that hasn't really happened. And if anything, the U.S. is more pro-Israel in terms of public opinion than it was when I was a kid. I make no predictions about 30 years into the future or whatever, but I think these are pretty deeply laid elements of national psychology. And national psychology is something that simply doesn't change overnight. Well, that's about it for prepared remarks. Thank you for listening so carefully. And I believe we have microphones here for questions. Right. And we'd like to take questions. Let me just remind you in general that a question is a short intervention that requests information or explanation, and if seen in written form would be punctuated with a question mark. This is something that is worth reflecting on at moments like this.
Okay, thank you for your talk very much. I wanted to add one question about something that dovetails with your analysis, but it was a little off the mark. I mean, a little bit off of what you said. I've heard it said that in reaction to the Holocaust and World War II, there was a general reaction among, let's say, well-meaning Europeans and Americans and others around the world that this should never happen again. Never again became a slogan. But that there were two roads coming from never again. There was a road that was a utopian road, meaning never again should be interpreted as there should never be national states who could come into such an awful conflict as this. And there was another road coming off of never again, which is never should a people like the Jews were be so vulnerable that they couldn't defend themselves. And so the people that followed the reaction to World War II with the never again that would hoped in utopian fashion, I would say, for the end of nation states, became very anti-Zionist as time went on. And those who interpreted never again as meaning people should have the capacity to defend themselves, and that will actually make the world a safer place, became sympathetic to Zionists. And so isn't that something that echoes very strongly with American sentiment, the more realistic interpretation of World War II?
I mean, maybe, but, I look at, say, Pakistan, which is a country where there's very little sympathy for Israel and a very strong sense that countries should be able to defend themselves and that there's no multinational, there's no cosmopolitanism there. So I think that's an attempt to kind of generalize the European changes in the European Union into some kind of global phenomenon. I don't see it so much.
Does it explain Europe versus America?
No, again, I mean, I think in America, the interesting thing again is that in America, when the left began to cool on Israel, the right heated up. It is interesting that as a more right-wing edge in Europe has begun to emerge, it has tended to be surprisingly, even if it's anti-Semitic domestically, it's often pro-Israel internationally. So in Hungary, you have a government which is literally putting posters of George Soros's face on the floors of streetcars so that people have to walk on his face to get in and out of public transportation, while also saying very nice things about Netanyahu. So it's changing in various ways, but I think it's very easy to just kind of say, okay, well, there's cosmopolitan evilness and nationalistic goodness, and that's how we can type everything. Yes, in the front here we have a question.
I've been studying this whole issue for 50 years. The first time I went to Israel was in 1968. And I went with a great sympathy for them, thinking that it was wonderful they had established their own state. And yet, over the years, I have changed my opinion completely. And I'm wondering, why can we support this state of Israel so heavily with our billions of dollars, and we let the Palestinians were forced. Millions have been forced out of their homes. Many have been killed. And when they began to rise up and try to show that we want independence, they are called terrorists.
Yeah.
And that word has formed so completely so that the American mind has the word terrorist connected with Arabs, with Palestinians. Remember in
Okay,
World
can we get,
War
what,
II
is there a
in
question?
France,
This is really turning
they were
into a
called
statement.
freedom fighters when they
Okay.
wanted their own land.
I think I understand, and
Just
I
may
don't.
I mean it. Let me finish here.
Well, if it's
I
a
want
question,
to know why they haven't let the occupation end and form a new state.
well, that would be a whole new, a different speech, and I mean, and a quite long one. And I'm not sure that I really have all those answers. It's, you know, I'm not as deeply into my study isn't 50 years old yet of this question. But I would say that there are a number of unsolved national issues in the world, of which this is one. And you know, we can look at the Tibetan problem, which is almost as old, 1955. The Uyghur problem, I've been reading that there are 1 million Uyghurs now in re-education camps in China. The Kurdish problem, which is not far from here. Problems left over from the partition in India and Pakistan. You know, the Rohingya, who are now the number forced away from home there is roughly equal to the original number of Palestinians in 1947. And in none of these cases do we see much sign of a resolution. You know, we've seen more refugees created in Syria in the last 5-6 years. Many of them are Palestinians who had fled to Syria and have now had to flee refugee camps in Syria. And, you know, so I think this is a class, a category of problems that the international system, 70 years after it really began its efforts with UNRWA following the Israeli War of Independence, does not have answers for it. But I would say this is not unique. It's also not unique that great powers, you know, do business even in a situation where things are not resolved. So no one says to Turkey, we're not going to have business with you. We're not going to let you in NATO because of the Kurds. No one says to China, we're not going to trade with you because of Tibet. So it's a much in that sense, it's a much larger problem.
Why do we send billions to Israel and have cut off every penny from the U.S. government has been cut off for the Palestinians who were forced into these refugee camps?
Well, to answer that question, you have to get into the political psychology of Donald Trump, and we may be able to talk about some of that tonight, but that's Donald Trump, and it is worth noting again, the overwhelming majority of the American Jewish population voted against Donald Trump. If the American Jews actually did control our policy on Israel, the embassy would be in Tel Aviv, and the money would be flowing to the Palestinians. Yes.
In the Declaration of Independence by Israel, I have to have this question resolved. Was it the Soviet Union or was it Truman and the United States who was the first to actually recognize the State of Israel?
The United States was the first to give de facto recognition. The Soviet Union was the first to give de jure recognition. Yes, back here.
So I really do appreciate And this is a really awesome insight on contextualizing this kind of obtuse, colonialist, evangelical, eschatological, whatever, American force. But to what extent does fleshing out that narrative, have you paid homage to that kind of eliminating the narrative of kind of the colonized force? And do you spend time on, I guess, contextualizing it without swallowing kind of the problematic
Well,
ties with it?
I mean, of course, I mean, like say I've met with many Palestinians and Arabs over the years. I'm a historian of the United States, though, and you know, this is our history. I don't try to pretty things up or, sort of cast sentimental glows over it, and I think it's up to people who know this history to think about what to do about it. But I suggest there are a lot of people in this room that are younger than me, are going to have a lot more than I have to do with the future. My job, I think at least something I hope I can do is give you some sense of what's been going on in the movie before you came into the show. And you are going to have to take it from there. Okay? Over here.
Hi, I was just wondering, where on the side of the argument do you stand personally?
Of which argument? There's so many.
Would you consider yourself, quote unquote, pro-Israel or pro-Palestine? What side of that argument would you come down on?
I'm one of these sort of miserable, wet, two-state solution people. And I think there needs to be two states. As I say that, I realize that I think the first sort of group who thought this was the Peel Commission back in 1936. People have been talking endlessly about it. It's much easier to say this is the answer than to figure out what it should be. I think there are real problems on both the Palestinian and the Israeli side that make this harder to get. I think the settlements are a significant problem. I don't think they're the only problem on the Israeli side as well as on the Palestinian side. I think when I've talked to people who actually, suppose someone like me who just kind of gasses about diplomacy, but people who've actually been involved very close up in the peace process, one of the things you do hear is the difficulty on the Palestinian side of getting a consensus of what it is you actually want. If we think about one interesting way to think about this, by the way, is the situation in Ireland, where they had a two-state solution for Ireland, almost 100 years ago. But there was still violence in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, and even today, the boundary between Northern Ireland and Ireland is a key issue in the Brexit negotiations, and people are talking about how that might blow up the whole Brexit negotiation. And that's compared to the Arab-Israeli problem, the Irish problem is actually reasonably simpler with many fewer moving parts. So I think that it's an illusion on either side to think that if the right person just did X, if Arafat had just signed this, or if Netanyahu would just do that, then poof, peace. That's not how things work in the real world. But right now, I would say things are on a downhill trajectory, especially for the Palestinians, in the sense that with the sort of collapse of the Arab world as a politically effective element, the chief allies of the Palestinians are really no longer in a position to do much for them. And so the situation's deteriorated rather badly from their point of view. It's and obviously the Trump administration is, I would say, nobody's idea of the even-handed broker, though we'll see what happens when they bring their peace plan out into the public view. Okay, back here.
One of the most interesting aspects of your talk was your reading of American public opinion, presumably inferred from polls and surveys, which in turn, of course, are crucially dependent upon the question you ask. Your general point was that the American public is overwhelmingly in favor of Israel as against the Palestinians. Let me put a suggestion to you. Suppose the American public were informed that since March the 30th this year, in the so-called March of Return in Gaza, 11 Israelis have been wounded, 3 of them were killed. Over 700 Palestinians have been killed, and 18,000 have been wounded, many maimed for life. In the face of that kind of data, where do you think the American public would come down on a question, do you feel that Israel's response to the Gaza march is proportionate or fair?
Well, again, I think the idea, proportionality is not as big an issue in American public opinion about the use of force as it is in many other cultures. That, we're one of the very few countries that has, gives an armed homeowner the right to kill an intruder. And some of these stand your ground laws and so on. So that would suggest that American public opinion, for better or for worse, is less moved by some of these kinds of considerations. And that we're looking, I think, less at a information in the media issue and more at a shape of popular culture issue. Which again is coming. I think I'm not endorsing these attitudes by saying that they exist, but I'm looking at a whole. If you think about the American attitude, how difficult it is, even these days, to get a conviction for a police officer who kills an unarmed civilian, even with witness testimony. You can't find many juries who are willing to convict. So there is a range of public behavior that suggests that for all whatever reasons, these attitudes are quite prevalent in the United States. They're not universal, but they're real. I have another question over there.
Thanks. This is, in your 2008 article, you make something of this, but you didn't mention it in your talk. So my question, the basic question is, I've always assumed, and I've spent a lot of time in both places, that the connect between the Americans and the Israelis is a sort of settler colonialist sort of mindset, and so you just assume that dispossession and asymmetries of power and things like that make sense. And so, in response to the issue of disproportionate force, it's just like, this is how a settler colonial sort of entity sort of operates. So that would make sense. But what I don't understand is how that maps the evolution that you're tracking between sort of the left and the right. And so, because, historically both the left and the right have been sort of in favor of the settler colonialist project. If we accept those terms, of course, and I realize that they're...
I don't think you'd get very far saying to the average American, well, of course, you're support of settler colonialism. No, but what I'm saying is I don't think people would recognize that as a description of their own psychology. It doesn't mean it's a good description, but I think it would be useful to try to figure out how they would describe it and think through, how settler colonialist is that really, or is that actually a label of another narrative onto a reality that's maybe a bit different from that. But there's not that much settler colonialism in America today that I can see. These are there are elements of, you think about in a lot of if you think about the recent election in Brazil, but attitudes toward the use of force by authorities, fear of chaos, and approval of sort of strong measures against it. I think it's actually reductionist to just simply say that's settler colonialist. Although I think history has something to do with how these attitudes got there. I think there are other forces at work, and we're likely to not get very far at dealing with it. But I would still say that, the sort of more interesting thing is the left-right, the shift. And I think this comes in part with the discovery of the Palestinians in terms of the left's evolution. Because if you go back and you actually look at what left-wing and liberal people were saying about the conflict in the 40s and 50s, what you find is they don't see the Palestinians as a nation. They see an Arab nation of which the Palestinians are a part, and they would use comparisons like, you can't give the Indians everything that they want and the Pakistanis everything that they want, but the Arabs are getting 97% of the Middle East, and that's reasonable. That in these partitions somebody gains, somebody loses, but that it seemed they were getting more. And at least at the time, decolonization was in fact giving independence to more Arab countries. So they saw it in that context. They also saw, by the way, at the time, Arab states like Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq were actually still to some degree British puppet regimes. And so they saw the hand of Britain behind Arab resistance. And so they actually did see Ben-Gurion as an anti-colonialist freedom fighter against the British, who had assembled a sinister mass of aristocrats and mullahs. It's also how Stalin was portrayed during his period of sympathy. But the emergence of the Palestinians, in part, and since it's when the Palestinians are betrayed by the Arabs in 47, 48, 49, and are and are now on their own. And as people, I think, on the left gradually realize that. Additionally, in places like France, the democratic left is looking at the Algerian situation, where it continued to defend the French project in Algeria for quite some time, and saw that as a democratic thing. So the left's vision of the conflict changed. To some degree, the right-wing American view of the conflict now is by and large the left-wing view of the 40s and 50s. Whether that will change over time, I don't know, but you'll often find that even the literary sources for their descriptions are coming out of the material that was produced at this time on the left. And by the way, in American politics, it was seen as the cynical, evil, big business Republicans with their ties to oil, and therefore the Arab, the evil Saudi Arabians, versus the plucky democratic Jews, survivors of fascism. So these narratives, this is, I think, one of the things you get if you, as you study the history, is the degree to which this struggle between these two peoples gets painted in different colors, and sort of different costumes are put on them in Western public opinion by different segments of Western public opinion, for reasons that have a lot more to do with what's going on internally in the West than for any, than for what's actually happening on the ground, and that events on the ground only slowly influence, and sometimes in rather strange and unpredictable ways, perceptions and opinions in the West. More questions? I see one back here. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's any sign or deviation shown by Gen Z or millennial Americans that might point to them bucking the general pro-Israel American narrative that you presented today, or maybe change it?
Well, it's probably a mistake to ask a boomer this, because literally, the boomers used to be millennial Gen Z. We were the secular, post-American, left-wing, unorthodox generation that was going to change U.S. perceptions on Arab-Israeli conflict, on socialism, on a whole range of things. And now we're the tired old farts who just want to keep going in the same way. So, do younger generations kind of, let off steam for a while and then settle down into the old routine? I don't know. It does seem that there is a couple of trends of secularism among the younger generation, but this is often not the segment of youth that is the most, that represents the people who are most committed on the pro-Israel side. So in other words, sort of a lot of people who grow up Catholic end up, kind of losing cultural Catholicism and identifying as nuns. But that's not one of the cohorts of population where the most fervent support of Israel came from. So it gets a very complicated situation. I do know that there are a lot of people, a lot of people study this subject much more professionally than I do, because for one thing, their goal is to try to change it. And there's intense effort being expended, where are Latinos going? Where are African Americans going? Where are young evangelicals going? They're very interesting conversations, but I would say it's too soon to tell. All right, well, thank you again very much. I hope this was helpful.